Llewellyn King is one of the most amazing human beings I've ever met, and I'm so happy to call him friend. And Llewellyn, you're on stage now. Please give him a warm welcome.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Andres. I always like to say, if you can't say something nice, stay quiet. After that introduction, I should probably retire. State of the Union. I must tell you that that was not my title, but it's Andres' title, and I'm glad to speak to it. The State of the Union, in my view, is quite strong in the United States. The state of our politics is quite putrid. Beyond that, we need to look at the world, and that is a tumultuous place. Never in the history of the world have we seen so many forces that could be so destructive of the orderly management of lives in so many countries. And the key there is electricity. Electricity has become the cutting edge of civilization, the defender of civilization, the one essential in a civilized society. No society is running of any consequence, any comfort, any security that is not based on the easy and reasonably priced availability of electricity. We have a wake-up, a strong, a powerful wake-up call in Europe this year. Europe is looking at a dismal, catastrophic, if you will, winter. Already electricity prices are between 5-fold and 10-fold what they should be. It is a major crisis in the United Kingdom, and although the apparent cause, and certainly a very large contributor, is the war in Ukraine, some of this was going to happen anyway. Some of it was foreseen and not acted upon. Winston Churchill said that a decision not taken is nonetheless a decision. And there were decisions taken and not taken across Western Europe that were not beneficial to the reliable provision of electricity going forward. In the United Kingdom, they delayed nuclear power construction. They delayed putting in additional gas storage, and they put all of their faith in wind power, particularly in the North Sea, because the wind always blows in the North Sea, except last fall it stopped blowing. And indeed, there was a great wind drought across Europe. Excuse me. A great wind drought across Europe with huge consequences. And then came the war in Ukraine, the largest war in Europe since the end of the Second World War, something we thought was beyond possibility, another ground war in Europe, a major engagement in war that we had not thought possible. We thought somehow Europe had gotten beyond war. We thought its new institutions, and particularly the fall of the Berlin Wall, had changed Russia. And so the threat, which has been there for Europe since the end of the Second World War, had gone away, that it was totally no longer a possibility, except now there is a war in Europe, and Russia is using its huge supply of gas into Europe. It has weaponized it. It is using it as a weapon with disastrous consequences for pricing, for the warmth of Europe this winter, and for the industrial base of Europe. Particularly affected, as you know, is Germany, which became especially dependent on Russian gas. How they did this, how willfully they did it, will be examined in history as one of the great follies of statesmanship. How they did that and turned against nuclear power with superb German engineering. Never a nuclear incident of any kind in Germany. But after Fukushima, there was a panic, a political panic, greatly assisted by the strength of the Green Party in Germany, and they started closing nuclear plants. They're now trying to keep the remaining 3, I think it is, open in the terrible situation they are facing this winter. The worst winter so far that Europe has faced collectively was the winter of 1944-45 as the Second World War wound down. Food was in very short supply. Heat was almost impossible to find. In Holland, the worst affected of the European countries, it was known as the hunger winter. We are now looking at a winter which may be the hunger winter for the world, and not just the Northern Hemisphere. Russia and Ukraine have been huge exporters of grain to the Middle East and to Africa. I am a native African. I was born in Zimbabwe, grew up there. Africa is very close to my heart and to my concerns. And to see those poor people who have seldom get enough to eat anyway, they will be starving on a grand scale this winter. When it's winter in the Northern Hemisphere, much of Africa, of course, will be in their summer. But nonetheless, there will not be enough food. Egypt gets between 70 and 90% of its grain from Ukraine. Every country in Africa has become in some way dependent on grain exports from Ukraine and or Russia. The consequences for world food supply are indeed grim, and we're not sure whether any country has the reserves to help. The one thing we know is that it will affect prices, and if the poor countries of Africa, some in Asia and some in South America, cannot afford to buy the grain, even if it is available, there will still be starvation. It seems to me impossible that any one country, including this very wealthy one that we are so lucky to live in, will have the resources to help very much with the world's potential famine. When it comes to energy, we are exporting all the natural gas we can get out of this country into Europe. And just today, Axios, the internet news source, explains how we are really pushing hard to send more natural gas to Europe as liquefied natural gas. We have only 7 export terminals. We can't build them in a hurry. You don't build a gas terminal, a liquefaction plant, and then on the other end, a plant to receive and gasify the liquefied gas. And unfortunately for Europe, most of the terminals that there are in the West, and most of the need is in the East. The question is a political one. What will happen? Will NATO hold strong against Russia, or will countries like, particularly Germany, cave, strike some sort of accommodation, stop the sanctions, and do deals to get the Russian gas flowing again? That is not in our interest. Long term, it is not in Europe's interest, because if Russia succeeds against Ukraine and succeeds in breaking the will of NATO, Russia will try elsewhere in Moldova and in the Baltic states, all of which are in terror of recolonization by the Russians. Latvia is in the front line, the cutting line of possible new annexation by Russia. It is a perilous situation. It is the world on the edge of catastrophe. And the one thing that shines through is that now and for the future, electricity is the most vital undertaking a country can have for the well-being of its people, for the prosperity of its businesses and its manufacturing, and for its security. If you knock out the electric supply to a country, you knock out a country. We have seen with blackouts the devastation we saw in Texas with Uri, where between 200 and I think the official number is 246 people died, mostly by freezing to death. A terrible way to die. We know what happens if you get sustained outages, you get civil unrest, you get, and in the end, you could look to seeing a kind of tribal battle for survival in the cities. People with guns roaming, looking for food and water and gasoline, because there will be no electricity to pump those vital things. So the supply of electricity is so important. Now we're looking and asking a lot of our electric system domestically. We're asking between now and 2050 to produce double the electricity. If we're going to electrify surface transportation, and possibly, as we heard yesterday, some aerial transportation, we're going to have to double the available electricity. At the same time, we're looking to get natural gas and especially coal out of the generation mix. It seems to me that that is an incredible request and that we are not set to meet it. We need new transmission. We're not likely to get it. We need transmission lines that run from the west, where there is plenty of solar and plenty of wind, to the east. We need to go from Colorado to Chicago, for example. We're not going to build those new lines. We may think we are. I think the Department of Energy has just put forward $10 billion towards new transmission. I suggest there's a better way, a more possible way, a more feasible way, and that is to look towards buttressing the grid we have. Little connections, stronger points, more generation close to the point of usage. We also need to bring into the mix, on an urgent basis, small modular reactors. They are the future both of clean electric generation and to pick up the base load responsibility that is not being fulfilled by wind or solar and cannot because of their inherent intermittency. In order to bring forward these reactors, we need some huge national program which might include, as a first step, a moratorium on the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's system of licensing. You cannot put a new idea through the kind of strictures that the NRC puts it through. And I get this from a former member of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission who says if you want small modular reactors, you've got to open it up, let people build them, see what happens, regulate them afterwards. And if you want to think of this in some other way, and a couple of examples I have, the great body of the nuclear reactors we have, I think there are 90 operating nuclear power plants, were licensed by the Atomic Energy Commission, which was a very different licensing regime from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, because it was part of an organization, the Atomic Energy Commission, which was a promotional agency. Its purpose was to spread nuclear use in every possible way. And there was a huge surge in the 50s and 60s. It was a fascinating time in nuclear. We wanted to build nuclear airplanes, nuclear trains, nuclear everything. That didn't all work out, but we had some interesting experimentation. If you really want to see the future that didn't quite happen, go to the Idaho National Laboratory in Idaho Falls and look at the hangar they built for the nuclear airplane before they built the nuclear airplane. Sort of, A backwards, if you will. You don't build a hangar before you know the dimensions of the aircraft it's going to use. And many other wondrous things. But there are also things that show what we can do. EBR-1, the first reactor, was built in 18 months. It's about this big. It's very small. It was a fast reactor. EBR-2, which was a much larger reactor and operated for 40 years, I believe, as an experimental reactor, was built in not much more time. At that time, we could build these things. We had a confidence. We had a certainty. And we had not set in place an enormous number of safety regimes that became, in their own way, not safety regimes, but toxic opponents of the technology they were regulating. And if you want to think about this, think about aviation. Had the Federal Aviation Administration been at Kitty Hawk, we probably would not all have flown here today. They would still be working on various aspects. We would have gone ahead. We wouldn't still have a fabric airplane made out of bicycle parts, but we might not have today's airliners. And the FAA has always been a much more of a promotional regulatory agency than a pure regulatory agency. The problem with pure regulation, as a purely regulation, is that it has no incentive, no dynamic that says what it is regulating must succeed. It says what it is regulating must be safe, which is an entirely different dynamic. Going forward, we have to treasure electricity. We have to treasure what we are doing and why this conference is so vital and why it is so incredibly exciting to be here with so many wondrous and wonderful minds looking at the conjunction of IoT and electricity, the management of electricity, the organization of electricity, and the analysis of electricity. It is a critical point in history. If we are really to save our civilization, we must save our electricity. And we must, as much as we can, look to the lessons of Europe. And remember, if you see a crisis coming and you ignore it, that is, as Winston Churchill said, a decision not taken. Or, as another British Prime Minister, Lloyd George, said during the First World War, it is dangerous to leap a chasm in 2 bounds. Thank you.